Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadare Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpaturubhyashta Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. Hopefully everyone's Kartik Mass is going very well, and especially the Bhishma Pancha these last 5 days. Hopefully it finds everyone blissfully engaged. So the normal sort of Ishtagosti class that I've been doing on Sunday, we had one last Sunday, and it was regarding a topic that I've spoken on in bits and pieces here and there according to questions that have come in. But there was a sort of, I don't know, like a dump, so to speak, of questions that came in and discussions that came in, including one person who wrote practically an essay, which I think I've been honest before, reading some of those things that are extremely long on the messenger and everything. It's a little tedious, so I'm not, obviously it's a means for being able to bring up these discussions, but it is tedious reading on the messenger. But I'd rather get it there than in my emails, because the emails start to get voluminous as well. Also, I've always been a little reticent about bringing or getting so much involved in consistent conversations about sort of material subject matter, so to speak. But the topic leaned towards the perspective of bhakti and social activism. And this stemmed from, like I said, a number of questions that came in. Some people were asking me to reiterate things that I've spoken on before about bits and pieces or parts and parcels of that issue, and so forth and so on. So I tried to have a Ishtagosti, and it was, nicely attended, and we had nice discussions, and devotees brought up interesting points, including, we did not record this one, but part of it was not only social activism outside the Vaishnava Mandal, but social activism within the Vaishnava Mandal. So that was an interesting twist, which I really didn't expect myself, but it was interesting, and hopefully I was able to give some food for thought in that regard. I don't ever claim to be able to completely and absolutely, cover some subject matter. But at least if there's a perspective and there's food for thought and there's more room for personal introspection on a topic, I feel satisfied that we've dealt with it. So quickly, because I don't have a lot of time this morning, which I always run across, and I don't think it's a bad thing. But basically, I just wanted to outline, because some devotees asked about whether the class was taped and where they could get it. So for those devotees who inquired, I'm just giving a brief overview of what we discussed. Not every single thing, because some things were sort of personal things, but just what could be discussed. So basically, we talked about definitions was the first thing. So when we talk about bhakti, obviously there is an established definition given by our acharyas, especially a definition given by Rupa Goswami Pad. Anya abhilasita sunyam jnana karmadya navritam anukulena Krishna anusilanam bhaktirutam. So uttama bhakti has been described in two categories. One is extrinsic and one is intrinsic qualities of pure or uttam bhakti. So the extrinsic quality is in the first line, to be void of any other desires except for the service of Krishna. So anya abhilasita sunyan, to be void of any other desire. Jnana karmadya navritam, we cannot live in this world without knowledge and activity. So here it's mentioning we want to not become enmeshed, if that's a word, or entangled in karma activities or gyan, which covers bhakti. So there are extensive definitions of what this means. So for instance, gyan is of three types: Tvam-parata gyan, Tat-parata gyan, and Brahma Jiva Aikya gyan. So Tvam-parata gyan, who is God, Tat-parata gyan, who is God, Tvam-parata gyan, who am I and what is our relationship, that is all favorable to bhakti and does not cover bhakti. Because anavrita means it should not cover bhakti. Jiva Aikya Brahma Gyan, any kind of knowledge which gives the arising in the consciousness to become one with God or to imitate being God or anything else along those lines, is obviously adverse to bhakti. And it will actually cover bhakti. So basically, this is a description of the first part of the verse. And then, of course, Anukulina Krishna Anusilanam. So Anukula means something which is favorable. So here it indicates obviously Saranagati, right? Anukulya Sankalpa. Doing those things which are favorable, which axiomatically then means Pratikulya Vivajanam, not doing things unfavorable. So all the other elements of Saranagati. So Anukulyena Krishna Anusilanam. So Anu means continuously and also means Anugati, under guidance, and Anu also means Anutva, which means with humility. We should continuously seal is a dhatu, silanam, the dhatu, seal means endeavors. So it means activities. And the activities are composed of both moods and actions, right? So all that together meaning that we should continuously endeavor to serve Krishna favorably under guidance and with great humility, and accepting the first part as well, putting them together, and not doing those things which will cover such bhakti, right? So this is like basic definition. There's many other parts to it. What is vyapti dosh, ati vyapti dosh, etc. So you can research, or perhaps another time we can discuss in detail this verse. So, but here's the basic definition of what is bhakti. So what has that got to do with social activism? Well, we don't live in a void, so to speak. So we live within the material paradigm. And in the material paradigm, there are many things that go on. And what is the relationship of the devotees with those things? So in some cases, devotees may make an absolute declaration of, I have nothing to do with the material world. But we don't find that necessarily to be true unless somebody has actually reached the point of transcendence. But en route to transcendence, we do have many pragmatic dealings with the material world. And this is why Mahaprabhu even gave the instruction to Raghunath Das Goswami, Antaranishtakara Bhayalokya Vyavyahara. That internally, of course, we should be nishta to our bhajan life. Means fixed in the advancement in our bhajan life. Bhayalokya Vyavyahara. To the external world, we should deal with it appropriately. So therefore, questions like how do we deal with the idea of social activism and dealing with what we perceive as injustices and this and that within a society, how is that dealt with by those in devotion? So first, again, we brought up a definition because we wanted to define clearly from a spiritual perspective what social means. So social here obviously refers to the society, and basically from a spiritual perspective, the society is in individual and collective karmic portfolios in combination with the three modes of material nature. It's pretty simplistic. The individual and collective karma of people constitutes the social fabric, and the influence of the three modes of material nature creates a matrix of and an intersection between those things, which gives rise to so many varieties within the modes of material nature of activity, some which are perceived as being just or unjust, or various other dualities when you observe them. So what is our response from that spiritual paradigm we talked about of being exclusively dedicated to the favorable service of Bhagavan? How do we relate to the idea of dealing with what's going on in the external world? So of course I just gave Mahaprabhu's opinion of what should be done. That Bhayalokya Vyavyahara, we should deal appropriately. And I once heard my Guru Parapadma, Nittalila Praveshtom Vishnupada Paramahamsa Tarasisiman, Shri Bhakti Vedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj. he gave a instruction to one Didi who had inquired during the Y2K, which was, I guess, when things changed over, there was speculation and conjecture that there'd be so much upheaval and this and that. And so she was asking at that time, well, what should we do? How should we prepare? And Srila Gurudev gave a pretty simplistic but pretty profound answer. He said, be prudent and chant Hare Krishna. So be prudent meant deal with the material world appropriately. So everybody's individual circumstances may be different. And you have to do prudent dealings according and pragmatic dealings according to that. But it should be rooted in shelter of Harinam. Chant Hare Krishna. Because in the long run, everything, we were on the phone conference last night, and one verse that's there in the first canto, 9th chapter, the last line of one verse is Vipra Dharma Achyuta Asraya. So this is a really deep thing, because Bhishma Dev is describing to the Pandavas how they had unjustly suffered. And he mentioned that under normal conditions, anybody would have given up, both given up their lives and given up their desire to live. But you Pandavas didn't do that. Why? Because Vipra Dharma Achyuta Sraya, because you had taken shelter of devotees. Here Vipra means devotees, Dharma means bhakti, Achyuta, the infallible Lord. So because they took shelter of Krishna according to the nature of their rasa, then even under the most extreme external social environments, they never gave up that connection. They never gave up their relationship with Krishna. So in our case, that would be concomitant to our level of Shraddha or faith. So he was pointing out that because they had taken shelter of the devotees, Bhakti and Bhagavan, then what is unimaginable kinds of unjust suffering, because he brings up the point, there was no cause justifiably for you to suffer. Being potentially burned in the house of lack, being banished, your kingdom being taken away, your wife being insulted, right? And then he goes on to say, and your mother, Kunti, how she suffered, because being a mother is sort of the heart of a family is the mother. That's the heart of a family, because a mother generally feels all of the aches and pains of whatever goes on in the family, even more so than fathers in most cases. So he's saying, and what about your mother? How she suffered witnessing all of these things. Because the vicarious connection between a mother and what happens with their children is, we see it practically in the world as well, is tremendous. So Bhishma Dev was saying, and how did she suffer? But then in the prayers of Queen Kunti, we know famous verses there that, oh my Lord, may the sufferings come again and again. Because I know in these sufferings, you will be present. So this idea of observing that there may be many things in the social fabric, according to the individual collective karma and the interaction of three modes of material nature, and according to also the spiritual climate. So our spiritual climate right now, our seasonal climatic spiritual condition is that of Kali Yuga. And in the Kali Yuga, Manda Sumanda Matayo, Manda Bhagyu Padrita, there's so many arguments, quarrels, all kinds of strange things. So it shouldn't be something that's surprising, especially devotees. If you're not apprised, you can look at the 12th canto, 1st chapter, Srimad Bhagavatam, and become completely apprised with what should be expected in Kali Yuga, right? Then, in dealing with the whole social fabric, we should not separate the idea that we need a kind of activism that's not included in being devotional. The answer, Al Srila Prabhupada especially maybe brought this out in a practical sense, because he had the obvious experience of preaching and bringing Krishna consciousness to the Western world, especially, and all over the world for that matter, pointed out how Krishna consciousness was, in fact, an absolute answer to all of the problems that existed in the social fabric. Somehow or another, devotees may, either by the influence of academia or by the influence of other kinds of modalities that have been introduced over the course of time into our Vaishnav Mandal, have began to think maybe there's other methods and approaches. But really, everything is there in Krishna consciousness. Why? Because the foundational aspect of change is when consciousness becomes changed. Any change that is not an evolution in consciousness is superficial, because it has come from the mental platform, and it may exist for one day or for some time, but then it may fade in view of something else that comes along and changes. And so this is the permanent feature of the material world, the constant mutations of things regarding, material dealings. But if someone has a genuine change of consciousness, that change of consciousness is permanent. This is one of the purports or meanings of Nihabri Kamana Shosti Prachavayona Vijite Swapam Pisha Dhamasha Trayate Matobhyat. This verse in Bhagavad Gita, that whatever is accomplished in the change of consciousness regarding bhakti, that's permanent. That is a permanent impression in the chitta or in the consciousness. So that change, even on a social level, is impactful. So when people are enlightened in spiritual life, that becomes true social activism, because the activities carry some potency. Activities which are based around superficial modalities of adjusting the material world are impermanent, because everything in the material world is impermanent. So in order to make substantive change, you have to introduce things which are substantively not changeable. And those are things which deal with change of consciousness. So when we speak about bhakti and social activism, they should not be divorced. We should maintain that our activities in bhakti are social activism. Just the example of your behavior sets a certain standard. Just your ability to communicate absolute truth in a relative environment is impactful. Your ability to enlighten and to make clear those things which are very misconceived about the material world, those are very impactful in actual conscious change. And that is real activism. Superficial activism based on material designations, whether it is the body, political affiliation, gender things, this, that, they are not permanent. They're not permanent things. And they will simply rotate within the influence of the modes of material nature from one situation to another. So they don't actually substantively change, they just morph into a temporal state that again, according to the modes, cycles around and comes back again. That's why a lot of times people look and say, well, how much progress has been made in social issues? Well, if so much progress has been made, why are we having a feeling of such overwhelming social injustice and all that kind of stuff right now? Because practically speaking, consciousness hasn't changed, right? Superficial things have been done, but consciousness hasn't really changed. And Srila Prabhupada said you cannot create absolute change with relative methodology. It's just not practical. It's just not real. If you want absolute practical or pragmatic change, you need absolute investment. An absolute investment comes from an absolute platform. Bhakti is absolute. So there's not really a difference between social activism and bhakti. Srila Goraksharas Babaji Maharaj, our acharyas have mentioned he was holding back the entire influence of Kali Yuga, meaning the modes of nature and everything else, by the potency of his bhajan life. And he was not marching, signing, protesting, or anything else. So I'm making sort of a very high digestible comparison by saying something like that. But it's a fact. that for those who are enlightened to some degree, they know what is the power of spirituality. And this becomes the basis under which any devotee is socially active. It can't be based on the temporal upadis or designations of the material body, because the material body itself is not permanent. So that person who is fighting for justice for one race in one life takes birth in the opposite race in the next life, and so forth and so on. Right? Now you could argue, well, still the principles of justice will be there. Yeah, but the way things are changed is, again, by absolute unfolding of consciousness. Consciousness doesn't change when it becomes spiritually imbued. It doesn't change. In the material framework or material paradigm, consciousness is always shifting because it's under the prabhav or influence of the three modes of material nature. So it's constantly changing. But when the spiritual energy exerts influence, it affects the consciousness in a permanent way. We just described it in that verse, etc. So this has also been analyzed. And what is that verse? Nashato vijite bhavo, nabo vijite shutaha, ubayo apidristo, tuanyos tatvadarshibir. That those who've observed these two interactions, those things which are materially based and are impermanent versus those things which are spiritually based and have permanency, analyzing the two things, the seers of truth have understood that the spiritual thing is therefore an absolute reality because it is permanent, and the material thing, being temporal, is not real. So social activism, first by the definitions we gave earlier, both of what is bhakti and obviously then what is social activism, and now bringing those two things into perspective, devotees are always social activists. They're not mundane social activists, and it's not such a great thing, this is my personal opinion, to conflate mundane social activism with bhakti. Because rather than contributing the lasting effect of actual conscious evolution, we end up participating and stimulating the material modes of nature and the interaction between that and people's individual and collective karma. That's why Srila Prabhupada said he was actually creating a revolution. Why? Because Srila Prabhupada took everybody from pimps to generals to Rhodes scholars to black to white to male, female, and everything in between, and brought them under the banner of absolute truth, with realized absolute truth. So it wasn't simply faith-based, it was faith with realization-based. So he was a practical example of bringing people together and making them have major conscious shifts, not only in their inner dealings of their consciousness, but even in the manifest activities. You saw people's lives change, how they viewed everything from their diet to their sexual habits. Everything was all switched by the influence of the spiritual potency coming from a pure devotee and the practice of pure transcendental spiritual reality. And it crossed all kinds of borders. What we talk about in wanting to see a unified world under, yeah, you can do that under a principle which is unifying. You will never find harmony and unity when all the individual karmic portfolios are unfolding and everybody has their own personal agendas. And those agendas become collective agendas when we find people who have similar desires according to their own karmic portfolios. That starts to form some kind of agenda and consensus about what should be done. Then those who are the most influential and the most powerful in terms of material facility, they get to execute their collective karmic agendas over those who don't, and this just simply perpetuates itself, right? So if we want to make actual active change, it has to be active change within the consciousness. And the consciousness is not changed by participating in stimulating the modes of nature and bodily identification and these sort of things. Actual conscious change takes place by being vehicles of the potency of spiritual energy. And if we can do that, then we are truly social activists. His Grace Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, he wrote a whole series of books called Spiritual Warrior, right? So if you want to identify with the mode of active warriorship in doing this, then be a spiritual warrior. Spiritual warrior with prudence means to be able to go out and be an effective carrier of the weapons of spirituality. Weapons of spirituality, in principle, means knowledge. And realized knowledge that come from both your having received it in a line of succession, a mentorial line of succession, a Guru Parampara, and also your own practice of that knowledge. So the combination of that is very powerful, and it is perhaps the deepest, most effective weapon in destroying the real enemy. Is never the manifest material situation we see. It is the ignorance imbued in that situation and the lack of spirituality imbued in that situation that's the real enemy. And Gyan, real knowledge, spiritual knowledge, has the ability to deal with that ignorance. It removes ignorance, just as light removes darkness. So that's real spiritual activism. So in a nutshell, we kind of went over that in the Sunday Istagosti class session that we had. So hopefully this was a little bit helpful for those who were unable to see it, and because we did not record it, we can have a little bit of flavor of what was discussed and how we discussed it and so forth, so on. So my Dandavat Pranam devotees, and hopefully this was okay also to answer some questions which I did not answer directly back on Messenger. Like I said, I think one person wrote almost an essay, and I haven't even finished reading it yet, what to speak of answering it. But perhaps what I did read, this did touch on some of that, so hopefully that person is somewhat satisfied, and I will not neglect following up to read the rest of what was written and try to answer. And for those who wrote shorter things or asked me just to discuss the topic in general, hopefully this was satisfactory. Please remember it also is the last 5 days of Kartik, so we want to have also very deep absorption in reading Sastra and our Shwadhyay, means our personal spiritual study, and trying to deepen our consciousness. Jai Vancha Kalpatarubhisha Kripa Sindhaveva Cha Patitanam Pavaneva Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.